Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody, depending where you are. You're very welcome to this session in part of the Good Practices Pod on gender and inclusion. My name is Mark Cumming, and I'm the head of Comhlámh, the Association of Volunteers and Development Workers from Ireland, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of this panel. We have a wonderful lineup of 5 different speakers presenting across 3 different presentations, and again, really topical, really important issues, looking at everything to doing from inequitable power dynamics in social relations, questions of intersectionality will be dealt with, obviously issues of gender-based violence and these questions of exclusion and marginalisation. And we'll also be learning about real life examples of gender and social inclusion in projects and programming around the world. Again, a wonderful panel of practitioners, researchers, and activists. So for the first presentation, let me introduce Geeta Pradhan, Margret Damba, and Rebecca Pursell-Gotz. Geeta is the Global Lead Advisor for Gender at VSO, with over 17 years experience across Asia, Pacific, and Africa. She leads the integration of VSO's strategic and technical approach to gender and social inclusion across its global portfolio. This includes advising programs and projects to integrate and embed gender to bring about transformative norm change. She's leading on programs on women's empowerment that tackle gender-based violence and embed gender-responsive programming across VSO's thematic work on health, education, and resilient livelihoods. Her colleague, Margret Damba. Margret is a social scientist committed to improving communities' social and development outcomes. She is an experienced gender and social inclusion expert in both the public and private sector in Southern Africa. Her skills are in both qualitative and quantitative research. She's volunteered with the VSO Zimbabwe since 2017 and was the lead researcher for the VSO country office, conducting the social exclusion and gender analysis research in 2019. She's currently volunteering as the Gender and Women Empowerment Advisor under the GBV Prevention Project, Speak It Loud, Zimbabwe. And our last colleague for this first presentation is Rebecca Pursell-Gotz, also with the VSO and a research specialist in volunteering for development. The second session will be led by Lechin. Lechin is a member of the Criterion Institute, an activist think tank with a mission to use innovative finance to achieve gender equality outcomes. As a social innovator, Lechin specializes in intersectional analysis and participatory methodologies. She's keen on pursuing transformative program and policy design that addresses inequitable power dynamics. And finally, Rebecca Tiessen. Rebecca is a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on gender and development and the role of volunteers and youth in advancing gender equality and human flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Geeta, and I'm based in Nepal. So, it would have been lovely to meet all of you, but we're doing this virtually. So our presentation will focus on our experience of implementing a gender responsive program in the era of COVID using volunteer for development approaches. And along with me, my co-presenters are Rebecca and Margret. Our presentation will focus on some of the findings that we did an evaluation study in Nepal, Kenya, Rwanda, and Zimbabwe, and following are some of the key findings which aligns with some of the latest report and assessment and findings that other organizations have done in terms of that there is an increase of gender-based violence during the COVID period. And also in our evaluation study of what we found was that 80% of the girls, they spend more hours doing household chores, and this, significantly increased, after the pandemic. And there's also a low value placed on girls' education. We found that in evaluation, 36 respondents suggested that they spent, enough time. They didn't have to continue their education during the lockdown. And also 60% of the respondents from Nepal, Zimbabwe, and Rwanda reported that incidents of gender-based violence had increased since the lockdown. And because of the COVID restrictions, we found that a lot of the health care and services were focused on COVID and other related. So SR, HR, especially sexual reproductive health services were disruptive, and especially for young women and girls, they found it difficult to access these services. So these are some of our gender responsive programming, and our findings showed that because we were able to train, our volunteers who are embedded within the communities on social inclusion and gender, and in times where we had strict lockdowns, we used digital tools and mediums and online platforms to train our volunteers. We were also able to, help and assist vulnerable women and girls seeking life-saving interventions and other public health services. And our volunteers also worked with the police as well as justice service providers for especially in terms of GVB referral services during the lockdown, where we also provided psychosocial support and other paralegal services, as well as health services that was the required ones for the GVB survivors. And our community and national volunteers were also able to support and assist the survivors by working with the other police officers as well as health personnel and justice-seeking providers to attend to GVB incidents, because a lot of times that people focus on COVID, and some of these went under the radar, and they weren't really supported. So our volunteers were able to work with the GVB survivors, and we were also able to create safe spaces and safe interaction opportunities for communities and family members, and dialogues, and some of our toll-free numbers that we provided during the strict lockdown COVID period were really helpful to the GVB survivors. And we also organized various online trainings, sessions and workshops that provided on menstrual hygiene management. And even in Nepal also, we also did organize trainings on reusable sanitary pads, which a lot of the girls and women weren't really able to access sanitary pads because the shops were closed and they weren't able to travel because of the lockdown. So all these ways in which we worked with our volunteers and who worked with the communities were able to support some of the gaps that was there due to COVID. And what we found was that because of the way that in which we were able to adapt our programs and also work with our community volunteers and other volunteers, national volunteers in the communities, and also running some of the radio programs on COVID awareness, GVB prevention, as well as how to increase the awareness in terms of some of the harmful and social and gender norms in those communities, because there was an increase of child marriage, there was an increase of gender-based violence, and some of our interventions, especially our radio interventions in the research showed that 46% they found the radio shows very effective. They were able to understand and get knowledge and information, and also where to go for reporting and for other support that GBV survivors needed. And because of the way that our volunteers who are embedded in the communities were able to mentor, capacitate and support vulnerable girls and women. So girls gained negotiation powers and skills, and when schools reopened, a lot of times when the girls, they were helping out with the parents and especially the mothers in terms of household care, and a lot of these girls are from really poor and vulnerable rural areas, and some of them, they couldn't really rejoin, but a lot of the girls that we worked with, they were able to negotiate with their parents and family members to rejoin school once it opened, and also to discuss, and delay some of the decisions around, early and forced child marriage. And we also did other capacity building in terms of mask making and other entrepreneurial skills, which helped women who were out of the jobs, and they gained new skills and they were able to start a new business and support their family members. And what we found was that through all these interventions, we were able to, increase, reporting. As you know, that in a lot of the countries that we work in, GVB is taboo. People don't want to, report about it or even to share about it because this is considered a private matter. So we were able to change some of this mindset and these attitudes in terms of breaking the culture of silence. So there was an increased awareness of, that they need to report, they need to take affirmative actions, but also how do you handle the stress and which are the appropriate services that are there that can help and support you. And girls were empowered, and GBV survivors, women were empowered in terms of reporting, but also knowing about their rights and the various information that was available during the time, which really helped and supported vulnerable women and girls in those communities that we worked with. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Geeta. Geeta's covered some of the findings of the evaluations that we did into our interventions delivered to women and girls and vulnerable people during COVID. I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking about how those interventions have evolved and the role of volunteers in doing so. In each of the countries and all of the programs that were focused on protecting women and girls during COVID, and with a specific focus predominantly on GBV and education and awareness raising, they were all very much volunteer-led, which meant that volunteering was embedded in the programs together with communities. People were working together side by side in what VSO calls a blended approach. The examples shared by Geeta are where we've had programs that have included national volunteers, community volunteers, and international volunteers who've worked together to support and train women and girls in various different ways. The focus of the projects included to adapt, innovate, and challenge patriarchal norms and attitudes, and really focus on trying to achieve transformative behavior change related to women's rights, access to education, the ability to negotiate relationships, and to find a business and find a way of establishing a kind of income. Next slide, please. The next two slides provide some further detail about the very specific activities that were undertaken in each of the different projects. This slide in particular pulls out 4 key activities which are crucial, which VSO recognizes as crucial. In particular, in Nepal, the focus on menstrual hygiene management was particularly prominent, and the role of peer educators, both in training women and young girls on how to create reusable sanitary pads, but also removing the taboo of people being able to access education and participate in day-to-day life, irrespective of menstruation. Other examples included where community volunteers themselves had contracted and recovered from COVID and provided education to other community members and girls and women specifically around how to protect oneself from becoming infected with COVID. The third key intervention area related to access to education and vocational training, where VSO spent some time working with young women and girls in helping them to coach them to be able to identify a particular vocational skill and training that they wish to develop in order to ensure that barriers to accessing those vocational opportunities were reduced. Some of the interventions included providing transportation to training programs for young girls to ensure that this wasn't a barrier to their ongoing participation. Guiding community members, and then quite significantly focusing on identifying and creating government scholarships for girls, so that after the VSO intervention had ended, access to vocational education could continue. The fourth being a strong emphasis on psychosocial support being provided to survivors of GBV and other forms of violence, and education among community members about their responsibility to those who have survived GBV. Next slide, please. The final example, and this relates also to VSO's work in the areas of social accountability, relates to community volunteers being trained in citizen-led monitoring and being able to record cases of violence against women and girls, gather the evidence and share these with government to allow for cases to be opened and investigations to continue. And as Geeta referenced earlier, focusing on encouraging people to report and creating a system that's able to respond to the needs of survivors of GBV. Programs related to education about child marriage and street dramas on GBV were particularly important, given that there were examples where young girls are often coerced into marriage at a very young age, and education interventions done through COVID tried to combat that risk and reduce the opportunity where child marriage was put forward as a possibility for vulnerable young women and girls. The other aspect which was undertaken was capacity building workshops with many community-based organizations to respond to GBV cases more effectively. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Margret Damba, who's based in Zimbabwe and has been very closely involved in the direct implementation of programs aimed at developing gender inclusion in the era of COVID. Some of these that she will speak to include a strong emphasis on capacity building and on policy development in working with our partner organizations. Thank you. Over to you, Margret.
All right, so I'll be sharing about the volunteer contribution that we are doing in Zimbabwe under the Speak It Loud project. Most of the areas that we are contributing is on gender inclusion. So we do capacity assessments on gender inclusion. We also do capacity building, strengthening, training workshops. We also do coaching and mentoring on gender policy development processes, as well as sharing knowledge on our expertise and skills as volunteers. Next slide. So my area on contributing on gender inclusion is actually also includes campaigns against gender-based violence that we usually do as a team of volunteers together with our CSOs to make sure that there's movement building to amplify the voices of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups. We also carry research, which we call social exclusion and gender analysis, to ensure that we identify gaps within our programming on gender inclusion. Next slide, please. Okay, so I do guide the CSOs, that is community-based organization under the Speak It Loud project, to self-assess themselves on inclusion and on gender. And I also ensure that during those self-assessment, they identify gaps in which then we identify how to plug those gaps within the programming of those CSOs. Next slide. Okay, then I also assist the CSOs on gender policy development. Mostly I do it by coaching and mentoring them. So it was during this pandemic that we actually found ourselves in a lockdown where I had to do the work under using virtual platforms. So those virtual platforms included emails, phone calls, and maybe follow-ups on WhatsApp platforms to ensure that those CSOs were able to actually carry out that duty by ensuring that they have gender policies within their programs. So all the CSOs so far have gender policies, and 6 of them have their policies approved by the Board of Trustees within the organization. Next slide. Okay, so this is a video that's gonna play just to highlight and to show how the gender process assisted the CSOs to include gender within their programming. So you can play through the video. Thank you.
My name is Florence Malope. I'm a board member of Sanamkazi Trust. We are the team that approved the gender policy. We were assisted by the Volunteer Service overseas. Since we now have the gender policy, our work is now more inclusive. We now work with people living with disability, men, women, elderly, and young women. As an organization, our gender approach is improved, guided by the gender policy.
Okay, thank you very much for following through the work that we are doing in Zimbabwe under the Speak It Loud. Twalumba, tatenda.
Thank you, and dhanyavad from all of us from VSO team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lechin. I am in Toronto, Canada. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very honored to be here. I work for the Criterion Institute, which is a global think tank specialized in gender lens investing. Our mission is to work with social change makers across sectors and industries to demystify finance and broadening their perspectives on how to engage with and shift financial systems to achieve equality outcomes. Woods has been partner for Criterion for a number of years as Woods continue to build their practice in the field of gender lens investing. We share a common vision that NGOs' engagement in the investment processes and the flow of capital is very important to drive development of a more inclusive and human-centered economies. So today I'm going to share with you some lessons we learned in a collaboration earlier this year on how volunteer cooperation organizations can contribute to the strategy of using finance for social change. So a little bit of background, we use one of Wood's latest volunteer cooperation program, the Ignite program, as a case study in this project. So the Ignite program's own objective is to mobilize 1,200 volunteers to advance gender equality and economic empowerment for over 1 million marginalized and disadvantaged youth, especially young women and girls. But for our collaboration, we are interested in the questions of how a volunteer cooperation organization or NGO like Woods could uniquely contribute to this strategy of influencing the systems of finance for social change. What is the strength and how can they be most effective in using that strategy? Before I dive in deeper, just some backgrounds about what we meant by gender lens investing. So the way we see gender lens investing is more than just investing in women or investing in women-led business. It's a fairly new approach within the field of innovative finance. Gender lens investing, at least the way we see it, it really emphasizes the approach of integrating gender analysis into investment analysis and decision-making processes. It's more than just simply counting how many women are in leadership or how many women are being employed or how many women receive funding, but really how taking a gender lens in the analysis and taking into consideration how gender norms and gender structures and social patterns have an impact on how values is assigned and how risks and opportunities is calculated within the financial analysis or the investment calculations, and how the terms and investment design has an impact on gender relationships or gender inequality. But there is an analysis gap because to integrate the logic of feminism or feminist approach and the logic of finance is not that natural, or there's no existing expertise in that has been practiced. So a lot of the finance, or very few finance professionals, have in-depth understanding of feminist approach or gender analysis. And on the other side, gender experts or community organizers have little experience in engaging in the investment processes, and very few of them speak the language of finance. So it's hard for them to articulate the relevance of social considerations to the systems of finance. And local communities, although they are most impacted by investments, their voice are often left out in the overall analysis and the decision-making processes. So we believe that there is a strong need to develop a translation function between gender and finance. This function will need to speak across fields and foster collaborations among different expertise. And specifically, it needs the ability to turn data to insights about gender, local context, and social patterns into meaningful inputs in the systems of finance. We think that volunteer cooperation organizations has the strong potential to become a translator. And through our interviews with Wood staff and volunteers and partners in both the headquarter office in Canada and their country offices in Southeast Asia and Africa, we kind of confirmed this hypothesis. Specifically, we see that the country offices or volunteer cooperation organization has been a very strong convener of partners from the private sector and the public sector and the civil societies. It has been experienced in playing this convening role across expertise and working with people that comes in with very different skill sets. So, by developing this translation function, it also offers new opportunities to engage volunteers with the strong gender backgrounds and volunteers coming from the systems of finance. And by developing this translation, it also offers development opportunity for these volunteers to develop a new expertise, being a translator between gender and finance. In the project, we identified a few recommendations for Woods and other organizations as how to continue to build up the capacities to become an effective translator. And I'm going to highlight a few here. One of them is to continue to strengthening that convening power of their country offices. The country office has been a relationship holder. So by strengthening that, it really means they really need to more strategically and intentionally to identify financial organizations that have a shared or aligned social mission and values as NGOs, and then foster the partnerships with NGOs and purpose-driven business partners and local technical assistance partners. The other thing is the other important role is to prioritize long-term volunteers because to be an effective translator, building the trustful relationships is one of the most important aspects. But building trust takes time. So for volunteers who could only commit a short time, so even though they have strong gender expertise or strong finance expertise, it's very hard for them to build trustful relationships if they can't commit a longer time. But we also heard these increasing challenges of having long-term volunteers. So we think of we see the need to create more kind of innovative programming to extend the engagement. One model that we see some potential is was last year is developing this e-volunteering program. So we are thinking a hybrid model may be useful in extending the time the volunteers engage in the program so that they will have some experience working in local communities, but also has more time engaging in the projects through e-volunteering. In this way, they may have a longer window to create these trustful relationships and be an effective translator. At the last, I just want to share this quote from a volunteer and just highlight the fact that building up the translation function and helping volunteers to develop a broader perspectives on how finance can be used for social change and how finance can have an impact, impacting community and people's life more tangibly, actually has a long-term effects, and that will help them becoming a more effective translator between gender and finance and gender and social goals, social developments in their home community as they bring that experience back. There's a long way forward, and we will continue our partnership with WOOS, but I will also love to hear your feedback and stay in touch. Thank you.
So my name is Rebecca Tiessen. I'm a professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. And I'm going to share with this session some of our findings in our research on international development volunteers and gender inclusion based on a 10-country study. So the rationale for this research has to do with the innovations in gender equality and women's empowerment and how urgently those are needed, in line with one of the SDGs, SDG 5, as well as some of the diverse strategies that are required to address gender equality, both practical and strategic, and some of the possibilities for partnerships in those transnational spaces. So we're looking at international development volunteers as transnational actors. There's a lack of research on volunteering in development contexts, and this has kept those contributions in that sector hidden, understudied, and undervalued, as some of our colleagues in this field have noted. Among the contributions of this study is the examination of spaces where gender relations can be and are being transformed, some of the distinctive contributions of international development volunteers as transnational actors engaged in gender equality and women's empowerment change processes, and building the potential for modeling different forms of gender norms and facilitating women's and men's questioning of their own perceptions of gender equality and consequently challenging preconceived notions of inclusion in development processes. So just to give you a quick overview of the research, it's a multi-year study with many countries involved, but we're going to give I'll give some snapshots today. These are the 10 countries here in the column on the left. You can look at those to see which countries we were working in for this most recent study. We did qualitative interviews with more than 150 partner organization staff in those 10 countries. Just want to acknowledge that this is a research project co-facilitated by my colleague Benjamin Lowe at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I want to also point out we worked with a large team in terms of data collection and analysis. Here are some of those contributors listed in my third arrow there. And finally, I want to thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as WOOS and CECI, who provided a lot of support and collaboration and insights in the process, as well as linking us up with many of the partner organizations in most of these countries. So I'll highlight a few major findings. I can't cover the whole study, but here are a few points. First, we found that the everyday interactions of IDVs change partners' perceptions of gender equality and women's empowerment. And one of the things that happens as a result is that international development volunteers demonstrate confidence in gender equality and women's empowerment, and that plays into the decisions and the reactions and the contributions also of partner organizations. They model inclusive development and alternative gender behaviors, and I'll highlight some of those points in my comments later. They initiate ongoing relationships and transnational flows even after they return home, so there was a sustainability component. And IDVs build capacity of local partners to conduct gender inclusive work. So in terms of building confidence, some of the IDVs were able to make women feel motivated and gave them energy to continue with their work. And this photo on the right-hand side of a colleague in Ghana is explaining her own confidence and how that was generated through her collaborative work with transnational actors. IDVs had influenced local women to explore and pursue important topics that they previously didn't feel comfortable exploring, like sexual harassment. And they also supported mutual learning on gender equality and women's empowerment through practical skills and organizational change. So one example in Malawi, a colleague contributed, "We have deliberately had training on workplace harassment targeting women. And I can confirm again that this time around, our women workers can proudly talk, can proudly protect their employment rights." In terms of modeling inclusive development, we saw that access to what was described as role models was seen as a positive, empowering, and motivating contribution for local women to take on new leadership roles. IDVs engaged in ending discrimination and facilitated innovations in program design. And they played this really interesting role of role models to encourage conversations about changing gender roles and promoting equality. In doing so, they displayed some alternative gender behaviors. So IDVs were known to perform gender non-conforming roles in local contexts. So as one contribution in our study found, the IDVs performed chores that they liked without minding cultural restrictions. Maybe they played football while male volunteers cooked or did childcare roles. So women would be playing football while male volunteers might cook or do childcare roles, things that were considered non-conforming gender roles in those societies. When observing a male volunteer cooking, community members were, quote, amazed that this person can actually do this. And it opened up conversations for the kinds of changing gender roles that were possible. And in some ways, the amusement turned into these important conversations that eventually changed attitudes. So some concluding thoughts that emerged from this study. One is that there are these possibilities for transformational gender equality and women's empowerment strategies. We can see those both in strategic gender issues that can be addressed in tandem with some of the practical development strategies for women's social and economic empowerment. International development volunteers also play an important role in shaping how the partner organizations understand power dynamics, gender relations, and the root causes of inequality. And most importantly, the partner organizations and volunteers both talk about mutual learning. Change emerges from the co-production of ideas that's generated through these meaningful discussions that take place between partner organization staff and international development volunteers in transnational spaces. A few outcomes that are observed and are highlighted in our most recent study that's going to be published in the next few weeks. One is capacity building. We see elements of gender inclusion in skills, training, and confidence building. Improve cross-cultural understanding, so mutual learning in those transnational spaces. Social innovation and women's economic empowerment. International development volunteers were creating unique opportunities to promote new businesses and new opportunities. Gender initiatives address masculinities and the inclusion of men and boys, and this is seen as having a much more comprehensive programming approach to addressing gender relations. Women's political empowerment and participation increased as a result of the collaborative work between IDVs and partner organizations, and there was a movement towards increased participation of women in decision-making in these communities where partner organizations were working. And lastly, there's a multiplier effect in promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. And we could see this in evidence from grassroots communities where we saw leadership and increased commitment that comes now from within the communities. So the change making is happening from the ground up. I just want to highlight the publication that I referred to. We have a 10-country study, and this is the top in bold here is the publication where you'll find it. It's open access and it should be published. It's in press at the moment, and it should be published in the next few weeks. And then a couple of other publications that have come out of this work. So thank you, and I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for your contributions. And I hope you have found that pod stimulating on very important questions. So it just remains for me to thank our colleagues, Geeta, Margret, and Rebecca, Lechin, and Rebecca, and to wish you all well.